A lot of people like to talk about what they call old school training. This let's define what do they mean by old school training? Old school training, in most people's minds, would be the type of training techniques and nutrition techniques or nutritional methods that we used, let's say, in the maybe the 70s and 80s. But the truth is, old school goes back a lot further than that. So before I go into a comparison between old school and new school training techniques, what has changed over the years, let's go way back to, let's say, the beginning of modern bodybuilding, which I would equate to be, when I say modern, I mean kind of similar to the way it is today with bodybuilding contests, Mr. America and so on. That would begin around the early 1940s. It produced a lot of great bodybuilding champions back then. A couple of them like Steve Reeves, who won the Mr. America in 1947. Clarence Ross was Mr. America in 1945. Then you have George Eifman, who was Mr. America in 1948. Alan Steffen, I believe, won it in 1946. I'm not going to go into every year who won the Mr. America, but all of these guys had one thing in common in that they trained fairly similarly. This was, you can call it the beginnings of old school training. The old school training, much of the development of what we call old school training can be accredited to a guy named Thomas DeLorme, who was a rehab specialist who worked with soldiers returning home from World War II right after, let's say, the mid-40s. A lot of these guys had injuries. They needed muscular rehabilitation. And back then, weight training or resistance training wasn't really considered as a means of helping to, let's say, heal and rehabilitate these injured soldiers. But DeLorme, who worked out himself, saw the potential of having these injured soldiers had a lot of musculoskeletal injuries. He had the idea of using rehab techniques involving resistance training. So he basically came up with what he called progressive resistance training, which involves constantly trying to add a little bit of resistance, a little bit of weight, every couple of workouts to gradually increase muscle size and strength. Another term for it is the overload system, where, in other words, to get muscles to grow, you have to provide some sort of overload. You have to provide more resistance than they used to. And this is the reason why resistance training, such as lifting weights, builds bigger muscles than, let's say, calisthenics. Calisthenics, you're limited to your own body weight, but with weight training, you can add more weight, which imposes more stress on the muscles, which equals greater size. So basically, DeLorme came up with a system. The basic system was to train 3 whole body workouts a week, 3 times a week, working the whole body. And he had basically consisted of exercises, so-called basic exercises, squats, bench press. He later on invented a resistant exercise machine. We could do several exercises at once. This was the forerunner to many of the multi-gym exercise machines you see today that involve bench press stations, lat machine, and this and that, leg press, all in one machine. He invented an early prototype of that. But basically, like I said, it was about 3 sets of about 8 to 10 reps. I'm not sure how many exercise. I don't think he had more than 2 or 3 exercises per muscle group. And as I said, the whole body was trained 3 times a week. This was the basic system used by the bodybuilders in the 40s. Like Steve Reeves, for example, he trained 3 times a week. He did about 3 sets per exercise, and all those great bodybuilders of the 40s did that. I think Reg Park was he initially won the Mr. Universe contest in 1951. He was from Britain. Later on, moved to South Africa. I think Reg was one of the first to start training a little bit more often than that. He might have trained maybe 4 or 5 times a week, maybe even 6 times a week. I'm not really sure, but as the years went by, the split routines evolved. The problem with doing the whole body 3 times a week, as anyone knows, if you're doing quite a number of sets, even 3 sets per exercise, it adds up, and it's quite fatiguing to work the whole body in one workout, even though you're getting a lot of rest between. You're training, let's say, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, so you get a lot of rehab, a lot of recuperation by having that rest day in between. But it takes a long time, so split routines started becoming more popular in, let's say, the mid-50s, where you would train 6 times a week. The initial split routines involved training each muscle 3 times a week. In other words, 3 times a week upper body, 3 times a week lower body. Again, though, when they started to increase the volume, where they would do like 15 to 20 sets per muscle group, training it 3 times a week proved to be too much. It wasn't enough recuperation time, so that evolved into training each muscle twice a week. And that's the way it was all the way into the 70s. Most of the bodybuilders, like Arnold Schwarzenegger, Lou Ferrigno, all the great bodybuilders, Franco Columbu, all the great bodybuilders of the Danny Padilla, all the great bodybuilders of the 70s followed a split routine where they trained 6 times a week, and they'd hit each muscle twice a week. Before a contest, some of the guys like Arnold, who had more time, would actually sometimes come in twice a day. They would train, let's say, legs in the morning and calves and abs in the afternoon, or something like that. That was also popular, but that was only done prior to a contest. In the off season, most of the so-called old school bodybuilders of the 70s, they trained maybe 4 times a week at the most, and the workouts were much shorter. They were no more than an hour. Some of them, like Frank Zane, only trained about a half hour, 4 times a week, these so-called maintenance workouts. So there was, in the 70s, there was 2 basic styles of training. One of them could be called the high volume style, which would be what I just described, 6 times a week, anywhere from 15 to 20 sets per muscle group, each muscle twice a week. The other style that began around 1970 or so was called high intensity training. Not to be confused with high intensity interval training. That's a form of aerobics. Nothing to do with what I'm talking about. High intensity training involved actually kind of going back a little bit, where you'd cut down the volume of training from 6 days a week to anywhere from 3 to twice a week. That's it. It would be whole body workouts. It'd be very, very low volume. No more than 2 sets per exercise, maybe at the most 4 to 6 sets total per muscle group. And, but the deal is, it would involve heavy training, as heavy as you can, very progressive, always adding reps or weight. Almost every other workout, you had to show some sign of progression. If you couldn't add weight, you would do more reps. This and that was extremely progressive. And because of the huge amount of recuperation you got between workouts, it was possible to make such progress. If you tried to do this every day, meaning training to failure every day, it would not be possible to be that progressive, because your muscles would not recuperate in time. Muscles need at least 48 hours recuperation between workouts, and larger muscles such as back and legs, for full recuperation, usually take 72 hours. And if you include a lot of what they call an eccentric component, or negative reps, which involves the lowering of the weight, that causes increased muscle damage that requires even more rest, maybe hitting each muscle past 72 hours, or as little as once a week. But the once a week training, training each muscle once a week, that didn't come into vogue until the late 80s. In the 70s, it was like 6 times a week, each muscle twice. And with the high volume, that's the high volume. The high intensity was 2 to 3 times a week, about 30 minutes per workout. Heavy weight, low volume, no more than 2 sets per exercise. Every set was done to complete failure. Those were the two predominant styles of training in the 70s. I tried them both. I went from a very high volume of training, where I did up more than 50 sets per muscle group, sometimes as many as 70, which was absolutely absurd. Quite frankly, I was like in my early 20s. I had no idea what I was doing. And the funny thing was, I actually made gains for about a month or 2, but then everything went backwards from overtraining. I'd start to lose muscle after about 2 months, because nobody can do 70 sets and make gains. You can't do it. It's gross overtraining. Gradually, in the 70s, you're moving into the 80s. 6 times a week, each muscle twice, still remained in vogue. The high intensity started to get less popular. Most bodybuilders didn't want to put in that kind of effort. They didn't like the idea of doing the whole body in each workout. A couple of diehards stayed with high-intensity training and were very successful. Men like Mike and Ray Menser, Dorian Yates, Casey Viator. These people stuck with the high-intensity training. Again, low volume, very high intensity, going to failure, heavy weight. They stayed with that, but most bodybuilders returned to doing the usual split routine of 6 times a week, each muscle twice. But as I said, as time passed into the 80s, another system evolved where now you trained each muscle only once a week, but you did a greater volume. So in other words, you did the equivalent volume, the volume matched hitting each muscle twice a week, but you did it in one workout. So in other words, if you did 6 sets for a muscle group twice a week, you would do 12 to as many as 18 sets once a week. And that's still the current way of split training. So one way that old school training evolved into new school training was you could say the evolution of split routines and the weight, the volume, amount of volume used in the workout. Now, what else? Now, speaking of, there's also, I should mention, in the 70s, the 60s, and 70s, there was a much greater emphasis on free weights rather than machines. Now, machines always existed. I mean, you had lat machines, leg extension machines, leg curl machines. You always had these standard basic pulley machines, of course. You've always had these machines, but there was no great emphasis on them. I mean, the emphasis was on basic heavy exercises with free weights, bench presses, bent over rows, chins or pull-ups. And, the pulleys were used as a finishing exercise. For example, you look at Arnold Schwarzenegger, his chest routine would start out with bench press. He would do incline bench press with a barbell. Then he would do a flat fly exercise with dumbbells. And then he might do some parallel bar dips. And he would finish off the chest routine with a pulley crossover, standing pulley crossover. And that was the extent of his machine use back then. Now today, Arnold, because of his age, he's an older guy. His workout, similar to mine, is now reversed, where it's mostly machines. Which still uses some free weights, but it's mostly machines because it's just easier on your joints to use machines if you're a little bit older. So that's one way. So there was more, again, the old school training involves a greater emphasis on using free weights rather than machines, and also a greater emphasis on basic weight training exercises like, again, the standards, bench press, squats, bent over rows. Today, you don't see a lot of guys doing heavy squats. There's another difference. Back then in the 70s, when I trained at the original Gold's Gym, everybody did barbell squats. Everybody. I mean, nobody who was interested in bodybuilding left barbell squats. There was a thought that barbell squats had such a great metabolic effect on the body that they increased the growth of the whole body. So everybody did some sort of barbell squat. Some people like to do front squats. Arnold would do barbell squats and front squats, but there was always a free weight squat done. Today, most bodybuilders, free weight squats are rare. Most bodybuilders, they don't want to, they think it's going to hurt their knees or it's going to make their butt grow too much. So they do exercises like leg presses. They do machine exercises. I'm not saying no one does barbell squats anymore, but it's much less frequent than, let's say, the old school training compared to today. Today you have, Dorian Yates has made a statement that, he doesn't believe that squats are necessary. He feels you can get all the size you want from doing leg presses. Now, the problem with that is that when you watch a lot of these people do leg presses, and I've talked about this in prior videos, they're using just absolutely horrendous form. Now, when you do a squat, the nature of the exercise, the way it's done, you almost have to do a full movement. Some guys like to do what they call parallel squats, where they go to parallel or 90-degree angles. Others prefer full squats where you go all the way down. But the point is, it's a full movement. It's a full range of motion for the thighs. Most people who do leg presses, from what I've observed, they're doing extremely limited range of motion. I know a lot of you people watching the video, I'm sure you've seen this. These people will pile on huge amounts of weight on a leg press, 8, 9, 10 plates, and they do these like, if you watch the range of motion, they're doing like, not, it wouldn't even be a quarter squat. It's like an 1/8 squat. It's putting more stress on the joints than it is on the thighs. They're not getting much benefit. They think they are because they're pushing weight. There's a woman who comes into Gold's Gym. I notice well, I don't know what she is really, but she puts on like 10, 12 plates on the leg press, and she goes down about maybe 1 or 2 inches. She does this all the time. I've seen her for months. Of course, no change at all in the thigh size, nothing, because she's not stimulating her thighs. So, again, that's a major difference between old school training and so-called new training, is that there was a much greater emphasis on exercise form. This is Bruno, my dog. Exercise form, as well as less emphasis on machines. There was greater emphasis on free weights. So let's talk a little about diet now. Old school dieting versus the way they diet today. First of all, the supplements were much more limited back then. In the 70s, there was almost no fat burner supplements, for example. They didn't exist back then. Except for, some people considered in the 60s, 2 nutrients, choline and inositol, were called lipotrophics, and they were often used as fat burners, but they were never fat burners. All they do is help the liver transport fat through the body. They were precursors for what they call lipoproteins, but they themselves never burned fat. That was a misnomer. So one difference between old school and today: no such thing as fat burners back then. There was no such thing as pre-workout supplements. The pre-workout supplements back in the 70s were 3 cups of coffee. And today, that's still my pre-workout supplement. It's still 3 cups of coffee. I don't use any pre-workout supplements. Not that I'm saying there's anything wrong with them, although some of them have ingredients that are extremely potentially dangerous. That they're basically weak amphetamines that in some susceptible people can cause a stroke. I don't recommend using brands of pre-workouts that have like DMAA. Some people say it's as safe as coffee. In the meantime, it's caused a number of strokes. It's banned by the U.S. Army because a couple of soldiers had strokes. So I don't want to get into pre-workout, but the point is there was no pre-workout supplements. The basic diet that was used in bodybuilding in the 70s was by most bodybuilders was a high-protein, low-carbohydrate diet. I used it myself, and that was almost everybody back then to lose body fat used a high-protein, low-carbohydrate diet. It's still used today, although now you have generally the much more varied use of dieting. Jay Cutler, for example, who won the Olympia 4 times, he thinks he says he can't train on low carbs. And Jay told me that he consumes as many as 1,000 grams of carbs a day, even before a Mr. Olympia contest that he competed in. He's obviously not insulin insensitive, because if you were, eating 1,000 carbs a day would completely inhibit fat burning. You would not lose any fat at all, contrary to what you might hear. But I won't get into the details about that. But that's the major difference. In other words, again, old school versus new school. Old school, much less variety of supplements. They did have a couple of supplements. They had meat-based protein powders, and they had milk and egg bits. But the most popular supplements back then in old school 70s were milk and egg protein supplements, and they were not as good as current whey supplements, which are a much purer form of protein. So you could say that the food supplements have greatly improved over the years. They're much more efficient and they're better quality. Now, a lot of people wonder about drug use back then compared to today. Well, I'll tell you that I don't know what everybody used back then, but I can tell you, generally speaking, the extent of drug use was nothing compared to what the pro bodybuilders or the elite bodybuilders use today. Typical bodybuilding drug stack for a contest would be something like decadurabolin, Dianabol, which is an oral steroid. Some people would add in a Winstrol, another oral steroid. Arnold preferred a drug from Germany called Primobolan, and some of the guys would also throw in a little bit of thyroid, a thyroid drug like Cytomel, with the idea that it would help them burn fat, which was debatable. It turns out that Cytomel was more effective at burning muscle than burning fat, but the guys didn't know it back then. There was no clenbuterol use back then. Clenbuterol use didn't come into really extensive use until the late 80s. In the 70s, there was no clenbuterol. In the 70s, contrary to popular belief, there was nobody used growth hormone. The growth hormone, again, started coming into use in the early 80s. That's when growth hormone use came into bodybuilding. And another thing that was never, ever even thought about being used in the 70s and earlier was insulin. The insulin is a 90s thing. The insulin started being used in the early 90s in bodybuilding. I'm not going to get into the reasons why insulin is used in bodybuilding. I'll just tell you briefly that it's used because it counteracts some of the negative effects of growth hormones, such as elevated blood glucose. Insulin is very useful for increasing glycogen, which makes the muscle look fuller. It also has anti-catabolic effects in muscle. It helps you to prevent muscle loss when you're on a strict diet, but it's also extremely dangerous. And if used wrong, it's also the most fattening hormone in the body. It can make you very fat if you use it wrong. And if you really use it wrong, meaning if you take it without any carbohydrates, it could knock you out, put you into a temporary coma. But I'm not going to go into the details on insulin. Another thing that was rare back then, and this is what I think I'll just finish off on this comparison between old school and new school. Another thing that was rare back then was what it's called today site enhancement injections. This involves it started with a substance called synthol, which is a type of medium chain triglyceride combined with lidocaine. It's like basically injecting oil in the muscle to puff up the muscle. And since then, variations of synthol have occurred using different types of oils, or some of them use paraffin. It could cause real problems. And some of the pros use it to puff up weak muscles. In other words, it'll give them a temporary size increase. Some of it works by actually causing inflammation in the muscle, which causes, again, the muscle to beef up a little bit. They inject it in their shoulders. Some of them inject it in their calves. This was very uncommon back in the 70s. I don't think anybody did what they call site enhancement injections. However, in the late, I'd say probably the late 70s, one particular steroid, anabolic steroid, was used for site injections, site enhancement. This was a drug called aceclidine. Aceclidine, it was not a very good steroid. In other words, it wasn't as anabolic as some of the more standard anabolic steroids. However, it did have one unique effect. It was very inflammatory. In other words, when you injected it into a muscle, it caused a temporary inflammation that gave a temporary size increase to muscle. So aceclidine was was the very first site enhancement technique. But again, this started, I'd say, the late 70s, early 80s. Didn't exist in the early 70s and the 60s. There was no such thing as site injections. So I think that's about it. That's about the main differences between. I'll add one other thing, though, that I have noticed. Since I go way back then, I guess you could say I'm an old school guy myself, and I've observed how people train over the years. And I go way back to the original Gold's Gym in Venice. And I can tell you that the original Gold's Gym in Venice, not everybody there was an elite bodybuilder, obviously. But for some reason, most people who trained there had a good inkling of what constituted good exercise form. Now, some people used a little bit looser form than others. When I say form, I'm talking about controlling the weight, not throwing it around, using good form where you put the stress on the muscle. You didn't jerk around the muscle, jerk it around drop the weight and all this kind of stuff. This was rarely seen in the back then. Again, even the people that had no particular bodybuilding goals, they seemed to train fairly correctly just from watching the elite bodybuilders like Arnold and the others. Watching them train, they kind of imitated the style they used, so they wound up training more or less correctly. Now, contrast this with today, where I go to the current incarnation of Gold's Gym, and I see nothing but horrendous, horrible form. I don't see. Sounds like a crazy statement, but I don't see anybody in that gym training correctly. They train with the worst form. I mean, I don't know where they get the. I mean, they'll do like they'll take a dumbbell and go like this, stupid stuff. It's not working any muscle. They're clueless. And some of the guys, I saw a guy doing a tricep extension. I'm not you're going to think I'm making this up. I'm not. This guy put the weight back here, right? Normally, this is the normal range of movement, like this, right? This is the way the guy was doing it. Watch, I'm not exact. This is the way he was doing tricep extensions, and this is the kind. And they do curls like this. They do I mean, there's a partial rep type of curl, but what they're doing is not even partial reps. They go like this. They go like 1 inch. It's not working anything, and this is all over the place. These people at Gold's are clueless. And I'm not even going to get into that's another major difference between old school and new school. They didn't have cell phones back in the 70s and 80s. So everybody focused on their training. They didn't sit around between sets for 20 minutes and play with Facebook and Instagram like these clueless morons do today. These guys will make no gains because you have to focus. You have to have a mind-muscle connection. If you really want it, you have to really focus on the muscle to stimulate all the deep muscle fibers that really are the ones that are stimulated to grow when you work out. And if you're fooling around with a stupid cell phone in between sets, your mind focus link is cut off. So you're just spinning your wheels. You're wasting your time. And I'm not telling you, again, this is hard to believe. When I go to Gold's Gym at night when it's late, it's not even as many people in there. It scares me to think what it must be like in the daytime. But at night, I would say out of the entire gym, me and maybe one other guy are the only people that are training without holding a cell phone on air. Everybody else does a set and sits between sets and plays with Facebook and Instagram. And sometimes they'll rest 20 minutes. Complete jerk offs, total waste of time. So that's another major difference between old school and new school. Meaning, the old school people were much more serious and much more focused, and as a result, they made much, much greater steady gains. The guys today make no gains. They're spinning their wheels. They're clueless. They don't know how to train. They play with their cell phones. They'd be better off staying home and watching Netflix, to be honest with you. So that's about it for old school versus new school. If you want to offer more information on nutrition, exercise science, anti-aging research that you can use today, effective fat loss techniques that really work, supplement science, which supplements work, which ones don't, hormonal therapy such as testosterone replacement therapy, all the recent studies about that. Anything that's medically indicative of even steroid use. I don't go into steroid programs because that's unethical. Women's health and fitness, all this stuff is covered in my Applied Metabolics newsletter, www.appliedmetabolics.com. It's anywhere from 40 to 50 pages every month, no ads, pure information that incorporates my nearly 60 years of constant study and empirical knowledge. In other words, stuff I've learned in the trenches just from working out for so many years. I pass it on to my subscribers so they don't make the same mistakes I make. And when you subscribe, I'll send you an invitation to join my private Applied Metabolics Facebook page, where each day I post new information on nutrition, exercise science, and medicine. I also have an email portal on my Applied Metabolics webpage where current subscribers only can send me short questions, anything they might have read in Applied Metabolics, or any short questions that come to mind. That look, here's Bruno. That'll be that you want answered. Bruno's old school, by the way. He's very old school. This guy is about 19 years old, still going strong. Look at him. Takes no steroids, drug free. Anyway, so subscribe today. www.appliedmetabolics.com. I guarantee you'll learn something no matter what your level of education. And I'll end this by saying, if you want to have your best friend, get one of these. This guy here, Bruno the Wonder Dog. Anyway, thanks for listening. Take care.